One of the major geopolitical battles that we have been in the midst of for really, I would say, the last decade, and it has become in earnest over the last 5 years that we've realized, some of us realized it sooner than others, oh, those guys in China, yeah, they're not really our friends. They want to dominate, diminish, and destroy all legitimacy of the United States. That's the truth. And there's a lot of people out there that still refuse to acknowledge it, many of them in our corporate larger universe, because the Disneys, the Nikes, the Hollywood studios, all of these companies are so reliant upon Apple, the money that they make from China, that they refuse to be willing to speak truth to power. So there's been this idea out there for some time, China may invade Taiwan. China is clearly intent on becoming the largest economy in the world. And they're going to do it. And there's nothing the United States can do against it. And Buck, over the last year or so, suddenly we've had, I think, a little bit more reality sweep in as it pertains to China. First of all, their economy reportedly, and again, you have to always kind of say reportedly because these are Chinese numbers. It's not as if they have independent media.
They've been cooking the books for 30 years.
That's right. So they say that their economy grew 3%, which probably means it declined, frankly, if they're saying it only grew 3%. And they're admitting this is the first year that their population has declined in over 60 years, which probably means their population started declining 5 or 6 or 8 years ago, would be my guess. But they're now admitting that their economy is growing slow and that their population has declined. And if you look at the demographics going forward for China, I think there is an argument to be made that China now is a lot like Japan in the 1980s. That everybody looked around and said, oh my goodness, Japan, if it keeps growing at this rate, is going to be bigger than the United States. They're a threat. We talked about this before. That great Michael Crichton movie, Rising Sun.
I read it in like the 6th grade. It's a little racy.
Oh, yeah. I actually I was reading yesterday, remember the woman who gets murdered and is naked in Rising Sun, the supermodel? She just, this is a downside here. She was actually died. I just reading her obituary, I think yesterday in either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. She was one of the 1990s era supermodels. She was in the Rising Sun movie. She was the woman who was killed early, spoiler alert, in the Rising Sun. By the way, Buck, somebody sent me a message and said, I was just planning on watching Gladiator, and then you spoiled it for me when we were talking about the
They're messing
sequel.
with you. No one...
I have to say, that is one of the funniest, if it were true, is one of the funniest emails that I've ever seen, because it raises the question, how long do you have to say spoiler alert, right? Like, certainly if the new Star Wars movie comes out, you have an obligation to say spoiler alert, but like, what's the age range
I think
here?
By the end of this, if it's a show, by the end of the season, there's no more spoiler alerts. And I think if it's a movie, by the end of the movie run in theaters, no more spoiler alerts. I think we got to keep this tight. I don't think we can let this drag on forever. You know,
yeah.
I mean,
you can't be saying, hey, spoiler alert, Darth Vader is Luke's father. I hope I didn't ruin Star Wars for people out there.
I knew what happened to Fredo before I saw Godfather Part 2, right? That's no one's fault. That's just, I came along later in life.
Did you watch The White Lotus yet?
I haven't.
There's a good White Lotus Season 2, which I liked better than White Lotus Season 1, although they're both like cringy but entertaining, has a really good Godfather because it's set in Sicily. Like there's a good Godfather interplay.
All right. Well, now I probably will check it out. I will say I watched the first episode of during lockdown because I was in New York City and it was hellish and there was nothing to do except eat, get fat, and play video games and watch Netflix. Remember, they shut down gyms.
I would have gone insane. When I visited your apartment and you were like, I did the show sitting right here, I was like, I came back. I think I told you then too, but I was like, I would have gone completely insane if I had been in a high rise, like living in an apartment.
It was an expensive cell in Midtown Manhattan that I was dealing with that whole thing in because you couldn't go to the roof. My building had a beautiful roof with views of you've been to it. We've hung out up there. They shut down the roof. It's outside. They just shut it down. Everything was shut down. Anyway. But I did start playing video games, which I had given up for. There are certain things in life that I may or may not have smoked a little weed in college, gave it up so I could go join the CIA. Haven't touched it since. Like, there are certain things that I've cut out of my life. I cut video games out of my. Not there's any. I think video games in the right proportion can be a lot of fun and a good way to de-stress. I'm not down on video games, but I was getting a little too good at like FIFA and Call of Duty, and I was getting to the point where like I was talking smack to 12-year-olds on the other side of the world.
You were playing random people. Like in
what?
Like you were playing not against a computer, but random people. Like,
oh yes. Yes, and occasionally you people would talk smack to me. I would talk smack back. I'm like, I don't even, this person. I don't know if they're 40 or 12.
Really,
but anyway,
really funny to think about you talking trash with like 12-year-old kids during FIFA soccer matches.
You may or may not have one of those headsets on too. We don't have to go there right now in detail. The point being, I started playing this game called The Last of Us.
Oh, the show just came out. Yeah,
the show. That's what I'm thinking of. And I actually watched. And there are the shows that I tell Carrie. I'm like, I just make a little separate bucket. I'm like, you will hate this. I will watch this without you. And that was as soon as she goes, "What's it about?" I was like, post-apocalyptic future, zombies based on a fungus. She was like, she cares about that as much as I care about the British royal family. But
although
it's by the guy. It's directed by the guy who did Chernobyl, which I thought was. Even with
I heard that was really good.
Really well done. There are a few issues with it, but it's really well done. And I will say, I can't think of a video game that has been made into a good series before. This so far, the first episode was pretty good, pretty solid.
I saw that 5 million people watched it. I knew nothing about it, other than I read that it was a video game. I haven't played.
I didn't know that, so I'm not like a weirdo all alone here. There are others who like it. It's got a very Walking Dead vibe to it. So if you like The Walking Dead, you will like The Last of Us.
No, it did really well, and so the rising sun angle, tying all this back in, I wonder, Buck, based on the China saying they only grew at 3%. And we've been talking about whether they're going to invade Taiwan. And also, now the population declining. India is set to become, if it hasn't already, the largest population in the world of any country. How much of China and all of their cockiness and their bristling is actually fake, sort of like drunk muscles that, somebody's
beer
talking
muscles?
A big game, beer muscles.
Yeah.
And in reality, if you look behind the scenes, China is actually every single day becoming weaker now.
So it's interesting, and I know there was this guy who had been at Stratfor who just did a big podcast. He did Joe Rogan's podcast, but it's getting a lot of attention. Have you seen this guy? And his whole, and I'm not leaving his name out on purpose, I just forget, but he'd been a Stratfor analyst, and his thing is China is... Like, we're all worried about China, and he says that I think he overstates the case of, just personally, of how weak China is at this point. But there's an interesting argument that China is, which is what you and I are talking about now, on a downward trajectory in a lot of ways, and it is because of a couple of things that people don't often think about, but if you look at it with a macro historical perspective, are incredibly important. Demographics and geography. The demographics of China are it has far too many males.
Yep. Because of the one China
policy
was a disaster.
Was absolutely disastrous. And China has a number of states, the littoral, Littoral, right? Littoral states, the Philippines, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, that hem it in on one side. And India to obviously its southwest, and Russia to its north. So geographically and demographically, there's a lot of pressure on China. And if anyone wants, there's a book, The Revenge of Geography by Kaplan that I highly recommend. It sounds boring. It's actually fascinating. Like the title sounds boring, but it's really, really good. China could have a lot of big problems ahead of it. But then you get into, is China, I think China does, by the way, is it more dangerous in decline, right?
In the short term, in the next 10 or 15 years, is that when they, because of the beer muscle theory, decide that they're going to try to show that they're stronger. They're actually weak. But they're trying to pretend to be strong.
I want Clay to give a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations or maybe at Davos, which is going on right now, on the beer muscles theory of Chinese relations, because I think, China-Taiwan relations, I think it could be worthwhile.
I think it could be something to keep an eye on, that if we could get through the next 10 or 15 years, that they are actually in significant decline. And if you want to draw that historical analogy, which is why we were mentioning the rising sun, for people who don't remember it, even the great movie Die Hard, Buck, in the late 80s, remember that was a Japanese company.
Japan was this financial and technological power that there were real people were concerned that Japan was going to just buy up and control the United States.
Right. And they kept saying, hey, if you don't want Japan to buy it, don't put it for sale, right? I mean, they were buying up all these incredible American assets, and then basically they've collapsed their demographics as destiny. They are aging faster than almost any country in the world. They're also not having children.
Did you read Tom Clancy, Dead of Honor?
Yes.
One of the Clancy greats. Clancy and Crichton were the two authors who made me think at a young age. I like books for fun, right?
Yes.
Fourth, fifth grade. They were the two that I was like, ooh, this is awesome. I got really into it. And Dead of Honor is about Japan going nuclear and essentially recreating some aspects of Imperial Japan from the Second World War with seizing U.S. territories like Guam. And for everyone, it does end. Spoiler alert, although it was from 20 some odd years ago, it ends with some guy riding a plane right into a joint session of Congress and essentially decapitating the entire U.S. government. That was before 9/11, by the way. That was written in the 90s.
So I just want everybody out there to be thinking about that as we engage in this battle with China. How much of China's public posturing is false bluster based on the real data that they are seeing behind the scenes of their economy collapsing and the demographics not being good, and how much of that tied in with their sudden abandonment, Buck, of their COVID strategy, which the Faucis of the world based our entire COVID strategy on.